I don't know if it says it there, but that was written by a former member of this diocese. Did you guys know Grant Lamarca? No, you didn't? He became, yeah, you did. He became a bishop. Well, he did a lot of missionary work with his wife, Wendy. She was a doctor, so they had an in into some very troubled parts of the world, including the Sudan. Mm-hmm. And one time I saw Grant walking with a cane, and instead of asking him directly, I was like, "What's with the cane?" The guy sitting next to me in a pew. And that's how I discovered that Grant had gotten shot. You don't expect when you get ordained that you're going to get shot. But in the part of the world that he was, it was in civil war. Wendy was welcome as a medical person. He was a missionary, and and so he was quite a guy. Still has quite a faith. He's a bishop now, and where is he, bishop? In Egypt, eh? Somewhere like that. Yeah, and he wrote that song when he was part of a band called, what's the name of the boat in the Narnia Chronicles? Don Treader.
Yes.
Don Treader. So that was the name of their group. Lovely song. One of those songs that just carries on. When I was planning for this morning, I usually start these days by making a joke about how long my sermons are and how you're so lucky to get Nick because his sermons are much shorter. I don't know how his services end up longer because his sermons are so much shorter. But in reality, this morning, with what I want to do, I want to take my time at it. And I want to sit up because we are talking about things eternal, particularly in the context of remembering Jacques. And not to correct Marie, but just to add to what she was saying, it is a part of the Anglican tradition to have services with intention. Mm-hmm. In fact, the church that I grew up in, very high Anglican, very liturgical, every service had special intention, usually for people who had passed away. And in fact, when it was an intention for somebody who had passed away as opposed to a saint, we used to wear a special stole. I was only a subdeacon, so I didn't get to wear one, but the clergy wore a special stole. And so we surround ourselves liturgically and in our community with things that are aids to memory and also aids to comfort and inspiration. And it's appropriate that the lesson for this morning just happened to be to the Thessalonians, and it's one of the readings that is suggested for funerals, where the apostle is saying, first of all, folks, I don't want you to be ignorant about this issue of death. He wants the people to be clear. And I got to say, starting from a personal point of view, one of the things when I was becoming a minister, I had to come to terms with was, what exactly did I feel about death? Did I fear about death? Did I think about it? What did I think happens after you die? What goes on in that process? Like most in our Western society, unlike people in the developing world, I had been very much shielded from death. We put death behind, I was going to say plate glass windows, but they're not plate glass windows, they're stained glass windows. If there are windows at all. We try to distance ourselves from death. And when you go into the hospital, death is seen as a failure, it's a failure for medicine to work, and we push it away and deny it as much as we possibly can. But then, studying to be a minister, I knew that one of the things I was going to have to deal with was the fact that people die. We all do. Probably none of us are going to be here in 50 years. Some of us quite a lot less than that. We're all going to die. And so what do we believe actually happens? And so what I did was I surrounded myself with a bunch of, I didn't realize it at the time, I wouldn't have said it in this word, using these words at the time, but with a bunch of rituals about death. Where I lived in NDG, I had moved downtown to be in seminary, but I had lived in NDG. The first D.A. Collins was on the corner of Sherbrooke and I think it was Old Orchard. I went to Collins because if you're gonna wanna find dead people, you go to funeral parlor. And so I went to D.A. Collins, and they gave me the tour, which, you know, I got to see the embalming room, and that was fun. The place where you buy the coffin, you know, they got all these coffins lined up, starting from, you know, solid bronze, you know, you got to mortgage your children to buy, and going down to cardboard, you know. Saw all that. And then I went into one of the rooms, and they let me do it by myself. And in those days, there were a lot more open coffins than there are now. And there was a person who I didn't know who was lying there. There was going to be the service the next day. And here was this person whose life was over, was ended. And right there, you know, smack, is like, so what do you believe? Is that it? Is that it? We'll just keep our memories warm in our heart, and we'll say all the sentimental right things, and we'll, you know, say all the sentimental right prayers, but that's it. That's it for her. Or do you believe there's something else? And I got to say, there were two parts of me, and they weren't at war, but there were two parts of me going on. One was my brain. You know, what did I actually think about what I was seeing? What did my education, upbringing, and culture tell me was the case? And the other thing, what did I feel in my heart? And I'm not sure whether one was more important than the other, but in my heart, in my gut, what I was feeling was that this couldn't possibly be the end. This couldn't possibly be the end. And I couldn't have given you a whole lot of content to that, but there was just, and I won't even say it was a profession of faith, but it was just something that was just deep inside of me, that though this person's physical processes had stopped, it wasn't the end. That somehow, on some level, we're of more value than just the purely physical functioning. Well, I later on, as time evolved, had opportunity to be present and to officiate lots of burials. I remember a lot of them. I don't remember every single one, but I remember a lot of them. I remember one in particular on a cold winter morning on Mount Royal, and trying to do it like properly with the book and all the rest of it. There's sometimes where you're just supposed to keep your hands under your coat. I got frostbite, you know, but I did the service right. And I remember when I was out in British Columbia being told by the funeral people it had been very, very wet and the cemetery was in sort of a valley. Don't get too close to the edge. Even though they buttressed it up with wood, don't get too close to the edge. But I was going to do it right. I was going to make the sign of the cross on the coffin with the sand, even though it was unwise, and the earth gave way, and I ended up sliding down. And those poor people, well, they were thinking, oh, poor Lorne. You know, it was quite an experience. I remember going into funeral parlor in Mascouche when I was the rector there once, and waiting for the people to come. Nobody came. Nobody came. And then I had to say to myself, well, what do I do here? It's only me. Do I do the full funeral service for me? there are no mourners, there's no family, there are no friends here? Or do I just, commend him to God and go home? My choice was to do the full funeral service. There was some thinking there. And I would remember those words that we say every time we do the Eucharist service, that we're surrounded by the angels, the archangels, and the multitude of the heavenly host. That's everybody else who's died. And I was thinking that even though it was just me physically, if I did believe in an afterlife, which I did and do, then it wasn't just me there in that room. And we, all of us, however many of the heavenly hosts showed up, we did the funeral service. And every now and then I go to a cemetery, and like here, a lot less than I used to. The holy word to use is I would make a pilgrimage. Pilgrimages can be long or short. You can make a pilgrimage to Lakeview, just pretty much down the street from where we live. And I would go up to the columbarium, and there's a lot of St. Mary's parishioners buried there, or interred. Their ashes are interred in the columbarium, and the field of honor, and that's where that guy's buried, and him, and I do that, and all this brings to you, what is it that you actually believe happens? And at various points in our life, for all of us, this notion of what happens when we die becomes very real. And so Paul is wise when he counsels that we should know what we believe before, And so that's what the next part of the sermon is about. But even this has a story. As I'm not going to mention name today, but as I think a lot of you know, one of the things that's happened relatively recently is I've reconnected with some members of youth groups long past. And that's a good thing. And most of them, it's just like a Facebook thing and an occasional post and stuff. But there's one or two that, we've sort of reestablished a relationship. And one of them, who's living the other end of the country, the other side of the country, her son is really bad into drugs, like really bad into drugs. And one of the things she's worried about is that he's going to die. We hear all the stuff on the news about fentanyl and people just being found dead about fentanyl. And you remember a couple of weeks ago there was a thing in the news about these two guys who were heroes when the train derailed and exploded, and they rescued a lot of people. Well, they are found dead under the Jacques-Cartier Bridge from fentanyl overdose. You didn't get that? And she's afraid that her 16-year-old son is going to be found dead. And when we were on the phone, she was crying, And I would have loved it if she still lived in this area and could come here and just be, surrounded and held and cuddled, and comforted. But there, if he dies, there's no comforting her. Her heart's already being torn apart just with the thought that he's going to die. But it led to a conversation about dying and afterlife and what comes next. So what does come next? I guess there's two ways that I could, approach this next part. One is in a just sort of general sense, general biblical, theological sense, and another is, again, in a personal sense. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of both. The promise, the biblical promise, is that Jesus has gone before us to pave the way for us. That's the biblical promise. That somehow he's blazed the trail. And, there's lots of word pictures in the Bible. How do you describe something that is beyond our ability to imagine? How do you describe heaven and being with God, like what would you do? Like if you were to try and paint a word picture of being with God, you know, well, surely you'd have to use words like streets paved with gold and pearly gates, you know, and stuff like that. You're going to come up culturally with the most glorious and the richest and the best images you have to describe that. But that doesn't mean heaven is a place where you're going to, you know, have 24-carat streets, you know, and where the gates are literally, it's just, this is imagery to describe that what happens after this life makes this life pale. That this life will seem like shadow in light of the reality of what happens afterward. So when I think of that lady who I saw in the coffin, or the first burial that I did, which I really, really remember, I probably buried about 200 people, maybe more. When I think of Jacques, I think of people in a state of being that is so transcendent, so much more glorious than this place, that even our best words and our words of the greatest riches that humanity has can only fall short. And you know what, in a funny way, I feel sorry for biblical literalists who take all those biblical images and think that they are literally true, because they can't even imagine that those pictures represent something that is so much grander, so much more glorious. Like, can you imagine a place where there's no pain? You know, can you imagine a place where there's no more grieving? That there's no more grieving, that you don't have to grieve anything, not just death itself, but the end of relationships, the loss of youth, all those things. Like, we grieve so many things. Imagine a state of being where there's nothing to grieve anymore. And can you imagine living in a state of permanent celebration? These are some of the things that the Bible invites us to consider. And so then, I think of myself and how I relate to that. And it's easy, you know, to get cheap and cheesy when you're sitting in a wheelchair. Duh, you know, like some of the things are just so obvious. But some of them aren't quite as obvious. I think of, when I think of the state of our being, you know, every culture, there has not been one culture known to humanity that has not had, I got to get all my negatives right, that has not had some notion of the afterlife. And it gets described in many, many different ways. Some of them I don't believe in, some I do, some I'm not sure about. For example, I don't believe in reincarnation. Like, I just don't believe in reincarnation. My faith in Jesus, who died to clear the way for us, is such that I don't have to do this again to get it better. You know, and reincarnation says you come back until you get it right. You know, and then you attain nirvana, which is literally translated as nothingness. So nirvana is the recognition that everything is illusion. So the idea is you keep coming back and coming back and coming back, hopefully getting better and better, until you reach a state of perfection where you realize that nothing exists, and then you become one with cosmic nothingness, nirvana. I have a hard time with that. You know, there's a lot of inherent contradictions there. there's other concepts of the afterlife. There's the sort of Northern European, sort of Norse-ish concept that the afterlife enables us to fulfill all the goals and aims and challenges of this life, but in a different body. That comes out of a warrior culture, by the way, and somewhat adapted. And then there's the Christian one that isn't as complete as we'd like it to be, that leaves some questions unanswered. When I'm dead and I meet people that I've known, what form will they be in? I don't think they'll be like Casper the Friendly Ghost. I'm told I'll recognize them, but when I meet Pat Roberts, how old will she be? Will she be 82 years old? Will she be 16 years old? Will she be like one of the younger members of one of my youth groups? What will I be like? You know, what form will I be in? Or will there be any form? Will I walk? Or is walking such an earthbound concept that it makes absolutely no sense to even consider it? You know? But by the same token, will I just be floating around the cosmos for eternity? Well, no, the angels have wings to help them get, you know, yeah, but we don't have wings because when you die, you're not an angel. You know, you don't become an angel. So there's all these questions. But what we're reassured about is that our personality survives, the essence of who we are survives, and we will be reunited in some form, whatever it looks like, with those whom we love. And that if, instead of running from death, like we do so well in this culture, I'm not suggesting we run to it, but if we embrace the promises that we're given in light of this very real step in our evolution as human beings, it will make more and more sense to us. And you know, the final part of the sermon, I remember a bishop that I knew a long time ago. I wish I'd shown him more respect and appreciated him more at the time, but I was young and foolish. And he had diabetes, you know. And did you know Russell Brown? You know Russell Brown? Yeah? Amazing man. And at one point he went to the hospital and he had a foot taken off because of the diabetes. Then he had another foot taken off, then he bit his leg. And one of the last times I spoke to him, maybe it was the last time, he said, "Lorne," he was British, this is my fake Russell accent, "Lorne, the Lord is taking me home one piece at a time." You know? And this was a man who had lived life, he'd been through 2 wars, lived life, embraced it, but had also come to terms with when life ends, and owned it. And he had no fear left. There was just no fear of death in him. It wasn't that he wanted to like jump off a bridge and end it all, but there was just no fear left. Because for him, death was just the next step. That was it. And you could call that, you know, you could call it being grounded, you could call it faithful, you could call it whatever you want. But for him, it was just going to be the next stage of his evolution. And that's what it is for us. At a certain point, for each and every one of us, death will be the next stage of our evolution as human souls, human beings. But it won't be to just sort of go into the cosmic void, but a place where there is joy and celebration and love And what else could be said? We'll be with all those people who we knew and loved and cherished and missed. And there won't be any pain. There won't be any sorrow. There won't be anything to cause those things. And for all of us, because of what Jesus did for us, it's a gift that we receive and a stage in our evolution. So as we remember Jacques and Nick and
Thank you.
yeah, and my dad, and your parents, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mike, Grandma, GM. That's what I meant. So you remember all these people. I just want to keep going, looking around because there's so many of you. And anyway, no, that someday that'll be it. We will move on into the next plane of our existence, and it'll be a time of joy and love. There's nothing to be afraid of. It's all taken care of.
Amen.
Wait, I stay here because we're doing the prayers again.